His hands would not stop shaking, not from fear, not from age, from something else entirely, something that had been building for 30 years, pressing against the inside of his chest like water behind a cracked dam. Marcus Chen stood backstage at the Riverside Auditorium in Los Angeles. 3,000 people waiting on the other side of that curtain, and he could not move. His interpreter hovered nearby, confused. The worship team had already looped through the opening song twice. People were shifting in their seats. But Marcus did not go out. He never went out until it came. Most people who filled those seats had no idea who Marcus Chen was before the anointing found him. They saw the healed. They heard the testimonies. They watched the man pace the platform with that unhurried certainty, that stillness behind the eyes that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They did not see the boy who learned to disappear. Marcus was born in 1921 in the Fujian province of China, the second son of a schoolteacher who believed that silence was a form of dignity and that God rewarded the careful. His father, a lean and exacting man named Chen had come to faith through a Scottish missionary whose name Marcus could never quite pronounce, and he passed that faith to his children the way he passed everything else. Through discipline, through repetition, through the quiet expectation that you would not embarrass the family. Their home was not cruel, but it was not warm either. It was a place where you learned early that need was weakness, and weakness was not permitted. Marcus was 7 years old the first time he heard his father weep. He had been awake past midnight with a fever that would not break. And through the thin wall between their rooms he heard the sound. Low, ragged, nothing like the composed man who corrected his calligraphy every evening. He never learned what his father had been praying about, but he pressed his palm flat against that wall in the dark and thought, "There is something on the other side of this man I have never seen." He spent the next 4 decades chasing it. By 14, Marcus had read the New Testament 3 times in the classical Chinese translation his father kept on the highest shelf, and twice more in the English his missionary schooling had given him. He had memorized the Sermon on the Mount. He could recite the book of John from memory. He was, by every external measure, a boy who loved God. But he was performing. He understood this even then. He sat in church and felt the congregation around him move to tears, move to something, and he watched it from behind glass, present but untouched. He raised his hand during altar calls. He prayed the prayers. He knew all the words. The words felt like a costume. At 16, he enrolled in a missionary training school in Shanghai run by a British organization whose name no longer exists. He was the youngest student by 3 years, and the most fluent in English by far. His professors were impressed. They gave him books and told him he was gifted. One of them, an older Welshman named Dr. Holt, who smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco, pulled him aside after a lecture and said, "You will go far, Chen. You have a mind for this." Marcus thanked him and walked back to his room and sat on his cot and stared at the ceiling and felt, with absolute clarity, that he had never once in his life truly encountered God. Not the real one, not the one his father had heard through the wall. He told no one this. The crisis came when he was 19. It did not arrive in a dramatic fashion. There was no vision, no voice, no Damascus Road. It arrived as a Tuesday afternoon in February, overcast, smelling of river and coal smoke. Marcus sitting at his study desk with a Greek lexicon open in front of him and a creeping, nauseating certainty that he had built his entire identity on something he did not actually believe. He closed the lexicon. He walked out of the school grounds and kept walking until he reached the riverbank. And he sat down on the cold stone embankment and watched the barges move slowly through the brown water, and had, for the first time in his 19 years, what he would later call an honest conversation with God. It was not eloquent. It was not the kind of prayer they taught in school. He said out loud to the river, "I don't know if you're real. I know everything about you, and I don't know if you're real, and I cannot keep doing this." Then he sat in silence. The barges moved. A bird called somewhere behind him. The water did not part. The sky did not open. A man on a nearby barge was shouting at someone about a rope. But something shifted, slightly, like a single degree of rotation on a compass needle. He walked back to the school. He opened his lexicon. He went to chapel that evening. But something had changed in the quality of his attention. He was no longer performing. He was watching, waiting. For the first time in his life, actually listening for an answer instead of filling the silence with the right words. 3 weeks later, a woman came to the school. Her name was Mrs. Fong, and she was nobody, or at least that was how the school administrators seemed to regard her. She was perhaps 60, stocky, with calloused hands and a direct way of looking at people that made the younger students uncomfortable. She was not educated. She could not read Greek. She had simply, she said, been asked by God to come and pray. The school principal, a cautious and orderly man, agreed to give her the chapel for one evening. Marcus almost did not go. He went because he had nothing to lose. Mrs. Fong did not preach. She did not lecture. She stood at the front of that chapel with perhaps 30 students gathered, and she prayed. And something happened in that room that Marcus Chen would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and failing. He said it was like standing in a doorway you had always known about, and suddenly realizing it had no door, that the thing you'd been reaching toward had been reaching back the entire time, that the glass you had been watching through was not glass at all, but your own unwillingness to step forward. He knelt on that chapel floor and wept for 2 hours. Not performance, not pressure. Something breaking open. When he finally stood, Mrs. Fong was already gone. He asked around later. No one knew where she had come from. No one had invited her. The principal could not remember how she had contacted the school. Marcus never found her again, but he carried that evening for the rest of his life like a coal pressed into his palm. Always warm, always present, always reminding him that what had happened to him in that chapel was not something he had manufactured. He graduated from the missionary school and returned to Fujian. He was 22 years old, and he had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to do next. His father wanted him to teach. It was sensible. There were positions available. The family had connections. Chen Wei-lin did not say, "Stop this religious nonsense." He would never say something so crude, but there was a quality to his silence on the subject of his son's calling that communicated the same thing in better grammar. Marcus spent 6 months teaching school and felt himself slowly going numb. He prayed, he read, he waited. He had learned in that chapel that there was something to wait for. The answer, when it came, was not what he expected. A pastor in a small inland village, a place called Tingzhou, 3 days' travel from the coast, had been writing to the missionary training school, requesting someone to help with a series of meetings. The request had been sitting unanswered for months. Everyone else had assignments. Everyone else had plans. No one wanted to go to Tingzhou. It was remote, poor, and had a reputation for being spiritually resistant. Marcus went to Tingzhou. He arrived in late autumn, 1943. The village had perhaps 400 people. The church had 30. The pastor was a widower in his 60s, who cooked rice every morning in the same cracked pot and seemed to have made his peace with small things. The first meeting had 11 people. Marcus stood at the front of that room and felt the familiar temptation to perform, to generate energy, to carry the meeting on personality and preparation. He had done it 100 times in school chapel services. He was good at it. People responded to it. He chose deliberately not to do it. He simply told the truth. He told them about the riverbank, about the lexicon and the barges and the bird calling behind him. He told them he had spent 19 years knowing everything about God without knowing God, and that one Tuesday in February, something had cracked open. By the 4th meeting, the room had 40 people. By the 2nd week, there were people standing outside the windows. He did not understand what was happening. He was not doing anything differently. He was simply being honest in public, which seemed to be a thing people were starving for. What followed were 10 years of what can only be called a wandering apprenticeship. Marcus traveled. Fujian, Jiang, Hunan. He went where he was asked, and some places where no one had asked him. He learned that the power that had broken open in that chapel, the thing Mrs. Fong had somehow carried into the room, was not something he could summon on demand. It came when it came. His job, as best he could understand it, was to stay close enough to receive it when it arrived, and to have the discipline not to fake it when it did not. This cost him more than he ever talked about publicly. There were meetings where nothing happened. 30 people gathered and waiting, and Marcus standing at the front in the quiet, hoping and feeling only the weight of his own insufficiency. Those nights he walked home in silence and lay awake and had conversations with God that were less like prayer and more like argument. Why tonight? Why here? These people came. He never got tidy answers. What he got slowly was a deepening of his capacity to wait. He began rising before dawn. Every morning, without exception, before any meeting, before any meal, before any conversation, Marcus Chen prayed. Not the formal prayers of his schooling. He sat with whatever the morning held and offered it back, the anxiety, the exhaustion, the occasions of doubt that never entirely left him, even at the height of his ministry. He told one of his closest friends years later, "I was never confident in myself. I was only confident in what I had experienced." Those are different things. He married in 1948. Her name was Ruth Huang, the daughter of a Cantonese pastor, 4 years younger than Marcus, with a practicality that balanced his tendency toward prolonged prayer and a warmth that the people around them felt the moment she walked into a room. She was not decoration. She was the structural load-bearing wall of everything he built. They had 4 children. The first 3 arrived in quick succession, a daughter, then 2 sons, and the family settled into a rhythm of movement and ministry that Ruth managed with a competence Marcus was never entirely able to articulate but could not imagine operating without. The 4th child, a son they named Philip, was born in 1953. Philip died in 1955. Meningitis, 18 months old. Marcus did not preach for 3 weeks after the funeral. He did not explain this to his congregation. He did not give an eloquent sermon about God's purposes in suffering. He went silent, which was perhaps more honest than any sermon could have been. When he returned to the pulpit, someone in the congregation asked him, gently, not unkindly, how he had held on to his faith through it. He said, "I didn't hold on to my faith. My faith held on to me. I wasn't strong enough to hold on to anything." That was not a prepared line. It was simply true. People wrote it down. The 1950s and 1960s brought a change in the scale of the work that Marcus had not anticipated, and, he admitted privately, had not entirely sought. The meetings grew. Word moved, the way word moves in communities of faith. Person by person, testimony by testimony, the healed cousin telling the skeptical brother, the restored marriage speaking louder than any advertisement. Marcus was not famous in the way that Western evangelists of that era were famous. He had no television program, no headquarters, no team of publicists. He had a battered suitcase and a train schedule, and Ruth, who kept the correspondence and made sure there was food. But in the villages and small cities of rural Asia, and eventually in the Chinese diaspora communities spreading across Southeast Asia, and then the Pacific Rim and then the Americas, his name was passed like something precious, cupped in both hands. He prayed for the sick. Not all of them were healed. He was honest about this in a way that some of his contemporaries were not, and it cost him certain invitations but earned him a different kind of trust. "I do not control this," he would say. "I am not the source. I am only the pipe. Sometimes the water flows through me. Sometimes I hold an empty pipe in front of a dying person and have nothing to offer but the fact that I am here." One man, a logger from the interior of Sabah whose legs had been crushed in an accident, came to Marcus in a wheelchair at a meeting in Kota Kinabalu in 1961. His name was Mr. Go. He had been told he would never walk again. His wife was there. His children were there. Marcus prayed for him for 40 minutes. Mr. Go did not walk that night. He walked 8 days later, in the middle of the night, alone in his own bedroom, and he told no one for 2 weeks because he could not believe it himself. When he finally came back to tell Marcus, Marcus wept, not with the satisfaction of the vindicated, with something closer to relief that he had not been asked to carry more than he could. He never used Mr. Go's healing as a promotional story. He told it only in private, only when it would help someone who was struggling. The decade that broke him open a second time was the 1970s. By then Marcus was in his 50s. His hair had gone fully white. The ministry had grown to a scale that required him to travel constantly, 6 months out of every year, sometimes more. His children were grown. Ruth had begun to show the particular exhaustion of a woman who has held a household together through decades of absence, who has answered the letters and managed the finances and raised children largely alone, and has done all of this with grace, which does not mean it was easy. Marcus knew. He was not oblivious. He and Ruth talked about it, Not enough, not with the depth the conversation required. And he always left again, because the invitations kept coming and the need seemed always greater than the cost. He told himself that God's call required sacrifice. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely honest. He was, in some way he could not yet name, afraid to stop. The years of constant movement had built a rhythm that insulated him from something. When he was traveling, he did not have to sit still long enough to feel what was accumulating. He did not have to be present for the slow erosions that distance produces in a marriage. He did not have to watch his adult children build lives that had room for the idea of their father, but not always for the man himself. His oldest daughter once said to him, carefully and without anger, that she had grown up with a father who was present in spirit but absent in body, and that she had spent most of her childhood being proud of him and missing him simultaneously, and that this was confusing in ways she was still sorting out. He had no adequate response to this. He went home after that visit and spent 4 days fasting and praying, and at the end of the 4 days did not have a neat resolution, but did have a clearer picture of the man God had made him and the man God had wanted him to be, and of the gap between them that his busyness had allowed him to ignore. He was 63 years old when the worst thing happened. His son David, the elder of the 2 surviving sons, a quiet and careful man who had gone into medicine, was killed in a car accident on a rainy highway in Oregon in 1984. David was 35. He had 3 children. His wife's name was Ellen. Marcus was in Hong Kong when he got the call. The person who brought him the news, a young man from the host church, said that Marcus simply sat down slowly in the chair nearest to him and held the telephone receiver in his lap and looked at the floor. He did not cry immediately. He sat there for a long time. Then he said, "Get Ruth on the phone." Ruth was in California, she already knew. Someone had called her first because they were not sure Marcus could hear it alone. He flew home. At David's funeral, Marcus did not speak. He sat in the front row next to Ruth and held her hand and let other people say the things that needed saying. Later, several of his longtime friends said it was the most powerful thing they had ever seen him do. Not perform his faith, not manage the optics of grief, just sit in the front row and grieve like a man who had no answers. He took no ministry engagements for 4 months. Some of the organizations that had been scheduling him grew anxious. A few wrote letters asking when he expected to resume his schedule. One letter, carefully worded, sympathetic in tone, essentially suggested that ministry was its own form of healing, that the best thing for grief was to return to work. Marcus did not respond to that letter. When he did return to ministry, he was different. Not diminished. The meetings were not smaller, the presence was not less. But something had dropped from him like a coat he had been wearing too long. He spoke about suffering now with a specificity that had not been there before. He did not speak around it. He did not resolve it too quickly into comfort. He had earned the right to sit in that place longer. The last great season of his ministry lasted roughly 15 years. From his late 60s into his early 80s, he moved less. He went deeper. He began taking young ministers through months of one-on-one mentoring. He insisted that each of them do what he had done in those early years. Not copy his methods, not replicate his messages, but find their own Tuesday afternoon on their own riverbank and have their own honest conversation and wait for the thing that could not be manufactured. He was less interested in results than he had ever been. He was more interested in roots. One of the men he mentored, a young Taiwanese American named Jonathan Wei, who is now himself in his 60s, said that Marcus had told him something he had never forgotten. They were sitting in Marcus's kitchen in Pasadena, drinking tea, and Jonathan was frustrated because a revival he had been involved in seemed to be losing momentum, and he could not figure out what he was doing wrong. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Jonathan, stop trying to sustain what you generated. You can only sustain what God gave. If it came from you, let it go. If it came from Him, it doesn't need you to hold it up." Jonathan said he went home and wept. Marcus Chen died on a Thursday morning in April 2003. He was 81 years old. Ruth was with him. He had been ill for some months. A cancer that he had initially refused to discuss publicly, and then, when it became impossible to hide, discussed with a directness that some people found almost startling. He said in one of his last recorded interviews, "I am not afraid to die. I am sometimes afraid of the dying, of being a burden to Ruth, of losing things slowly. But death itself, no. I have been walking toward it for 80 years. I don't expect it to surprise me. Ruth held his hand when it happened. He had been fading for 2 days, in and out of consciousness. The children who were reachable had come. His daughter was there. Jonathan Way was there. At some point in the early morning, Marcus opened his eyes, looked at Ruth, and said something. She said later that she was not certain she had heard correctly, that it could have been the medication, that she did not want to make a story out of it. But what she thought she heard was, "There it is." Then he closed his eyes. He prayed for people individually, one by one, for more than 40 years. He kept no official count. No organization tracked the numbers. That was deliberate. He found the accounting, the tallying of miracles, to be faintly repellent. He once said, "The moment you start counting, you've turned something sacred into something statistical." He lost a son at 18 months. He buried an adult child in middle age. He was absent for too much of his family's life, and he knew it, and he did not excuse it, only held it. He wrestled with doubt at regular intervals for 6 decades and never pretended otherwise. He waited every time before he went out. There are people still living who were healed in those meetings. There are pastors whose ministries exist because he sat across a kitchen table from them and refused to let them settle for generated momentum when given momentum was available. And there is Jonathan Way in his 60s now, who says that whenever he is about to step out onto a platform, he stops. He waits. He does not go out until he feels what Marcus taught him to wait for. He says he does not always know when it comes. He says you learn to recognize it. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, quiet and entirely certain, and in that moment you know that what is about to happen is not coming from you. Marcus Chen spent a lifetime learning that. He called it the most important thing he ever learned. He never called it easy. He never called it guaranteed. He called it the only thing worth waiting for. If you've ever stood at the edge of something that was bigger than you, if you've ever felt the difference between performing and actually receiving, you know what he was waiting for. Comment below and tell us. I will wait for what only God can give. And let us know which life you'd like us to cover next on Circle of Believers.